we might do that with a little baby, but if a 2-year-old, 3-year-old kid misbehaves, what do? We give that kid a warning, and then they're going to get a consequence. Why don't these children deserve the same steps? While most children, and again, it will probably take the advent of new meds to make this job easier. I want to stress something. I will touch on the fact that part of my hope is that we will have a chance to include the children in new things that are coming. This is probably my first public statement of this, that many who know me, I have been extremely down. I guess as a physician, I'd have to say depressed over the last 6-8 months, because what Kay alluded to earlier, I was supposed to come out here and talk about 3 years ago. I also know as a pediatrician that unfortunately, children are not the first priority when it comes to drug trials or medications. In fact, most companies do not want to touch a child with a 10-foot pole because of liability. So myself, researchers I was involved with, were unfortunately totally misled by a gentleman who said for 2 years plus, he was going to take care of the adults, take care of the kids, and finally, the researchers I'm with just gave, finally, I mean, to this day, he'd probably say the money's going to be there, but never came through. And I became very frustrated, depressed, because the researchers I was with were going to get funded then for the adults. Again, kids are not the first priority. So to me, this was a disaster. It's almost like what could every parent wish for out there, and you weren't going to get it. Now, I'm standing up here much happier today, as I will explain along the way and touch on. If everything goes right, and I believe at this point it will, we're going to get help setting up neural spec centers, diagnostic treatment centers for your children. Hopefully it may be children and adults. And I don't know if I will have to raise money or whether the money is going to be there, but I have been given absolute assurance the children will have a right to these new trials as a first priority, not 5 or 10 years from now. So in everything I say and every piece of frustration you hear, from my direction, I think there's going to be a much better path ahead for you. Because the truth is, there are drugs in existence, medications would be a much better word than drugs, that are very unique, very new. What people have done out there, everyone's saying immune system, okay? As I said to a parent earlier, unfortunately, most of the people saying immune system don't understand at all what's really wrong. If your immune system is active, and I pour a bunch of supplements into you, and those supplements are not pharmaceutically pure, I have a higher chance of pushing off that immune system than I do of helping your child, okay? In the past, when we've dealt with immune diseases, I trained UCLA, got early introduction to what we at that time called collagen vascular diseases, lupus, scleroderma, multiple other disorders like that. We now, of course, look at them as autoimmune. And in the past, our therapies have been their own problems. If you give somebody steroids, you shut down their immune system, you open them up to a lot of other problems. If you give people things to boost their immune system, you often have other problems of harm. What you're looking at is technology that I've literally known about now for 10 years plus, is going to be brought into trial, is pharmaceutical, and for the first time may have the ability to take a system that is upregulated, bring it to normal, downregulated, bring that to normal, and make a body healthy, adult or child. So if you ask where this should go to, that's where we've got to get to, and that is possible. But in the meantime, how I look at this is what can I do with the tools I have to help make that immune system healthy. I want to bring you to that focus until we get to new agents that might just do all this in one step. You've got to look at how can you take your children now, understand that reactive immune system, and help them. So what has happened for me is by combining steps, there's not one agent right now out there that does everything, okay? I have multiple children in regular classes, often joke top of their classes, and many of those children are now in honors classes. someone said something to me at the break. If you look at this as the world of autism, go before Congress, as the groups have done, and say, we have an epidemic of autism. First off, that statement is entirely wrong. You can't have an epidemic of autism. But number two, think what's been occurring out there. We're telling the whole world your children have a crisis, but maybe we'll figure out how to prevent this in another decade or two. Nobody is seriously looking at your children in how do we get them a chance to function and become adults now, okay? That's the message that has to get to Congress. Now, I've got older kids, as I said, talking that never talked before. And I get very nice feedback from the moms that the therapists are amazed because they're seeing children do things they've never done before. Well, again, in the world of autism, you don't expect it. In the world of pediatrics, I will tell you, I've come to expect it. In fact, I just had a situation, I was very pleased to be interviewed on Autism One Radio. I actually think this interview is up on their archives. And the person doing the interview had prepared a very good set of questions. One of her questions was, describe your miraculous cures. Okay? Now, what I said was, I don't look at this as miraculous cures. If this is an illness or disease, I expect a child to get better. Let me give you an example. And ironically, the interview was a day after this happened. I said, let me tell you about my morning yesterday morning seeing patients. Out of my first 4 patients, one was a mother with chronic fatigue syndrome that is one of the few adults I still take care of. She's actually a very, very interesting patient. She's one of the only adults I've seen, much less any child, that had significantly, legally, blood test elevations of mercury. Okay, there wouldn't be anybody around who wouldn't say this lady had elevated mercury. Now, by the time I saw her, she had already gone through chelation, IV nutrients, all the things done to your kids are done in greater numbers to the adults, and nothing had helped. I told her when I met her that in her case, yes, the mercury was legit, at least in theory, but that I did not ever deal with that per se. And why don't I start working with her the way I work with any adult or child at this point? Within 3 to 4 months, her mercury levels came down to normal, and they have never gone up again. I re-stress to you, if you get the body healthy, Mother Nature can do a whole lot better job than we can. Now, the 3 children in the morning, they were all in a 4 or 5-year-old range. My discussion with each parent was how they would be starting kindergarten, how we had to make sure that they got a good year in education, that any residual deficits were caught up on, but they were all on their way to being extremely normal children. The next couple of kids that morning were like 6, 7 years old. One of them had SPECT scan follow-up, and the discussion was that how we had probably another year or 2 ahead if we got people to do the right steps with the children. That's one of my biggest problems. I can get a child's brain working, but when the educational system or the therapists don't understand that or believe in it, they're not helping to do that rehabilitation that is so critical. So I spend a lot of my time talking to the parents that they need to get the schools, the educators to listen to them. But that was my morning. Now I would challenge anyone. How many quote unquote, and again, I gotta hate the word, autistic specialists have that kind of a morning? Now, if a disease state exists, then the multiple children I have, I use the word normalize. I'm not totally comfortable with using a cure unless I know a child's immune system is totally cured down. I mean, I have a bunch of children out there functioning normal who are still on a maintenance antiviral, but the key is, these kids could not have changed by things I've done if they were born miswired. And what I would like to see happen is, again, what have we done out there in this old concept of autism, basically developmental, controlled by psychologists and psychiatrists? We took doctors out of the picture. You go to your pediatrician, and he may feel sorry for you, but he's not told he can do anything to help you. And that's not a very good feeling. How many teachers, special ed people, trained to be told, well, here's a bunch of children, do the best you can, but you can't really help them. That's a pretty depressing way to go for everybody. But let's flip it around. What I saw very quickly when I entered into this, I made you the statement a while early in the talk, then my wife really said, what are you doing stepping into this? Didn't take me very long as a pediatrician to realize that these were children. I get a 5 or 6-year-old kid, start them on treatment. They would give the parents the terrible twos. Well, please tell me how a kid who is 5 or 6 or 8 or 9 can go back and literally pick up developmentally where their brain shut down if that was a broken brain. So what I've come to look at, and I hope we can get the medical system to join in, is these are ill children. We need to treat what we can as part of their illness. Now, I'm going to give you a case study. This you could take from me from multiple cases, okay? I don't want to sit here and put 20 cases up, but I'll kind of bring this together. This was a girl, had a large head at birth. Remember that large head versus microcephaly? Had jaundice, common to many children, some problems with breastfeeding, was social, interacted with mom and dad. Now, when I was at the midst of my total frustration, afraid that we were going to lose this opportunity for your children, as a physician, I go back to the literature, okay? I keep trying to say to all of you, if we're going to succeed, you're only going to succeed by logic and facts. The medical world is not going to listen if we don't do it correctly. I went back, and again, in frustration, to literature. How many of you know that in review articles in the 50s, this new idea of autism, how did you separate the kids with this new idea of autism from kids with childhood schizophrenia? Don't forget, this was all psychological. The separation was a child with autism never had social skills. Now, if all we did was go back to that one criteria, 99% of your children would not fit it. Think about that. This kid also had some words at 9 months old. Now, you're not told about this, but I attended a symposium 96, 97 on social brain. It was from basically Alzheimer's in adults down to autism in children. And one of the main groups that heard exactly what I'm telling you, but they certainly made sure it wasn't publicized out there. These were top researchers from around the country. One of them had been actually the inventor of Fast Forward. And I might make a side comment that I said to someone at the break. Sound can do good and it can do harm. If you're doing any type of sound therapy with your children, if it seems to be helping them, if they seem to be enjoying it, maybe it's okay. But if they're resisting it, stop it immediately. There is nothing that says sound is totally safe. We can do good, we can do harm. But out of that meeting came the statement, if a child developed normally for the first 12, 15, 18 months of life, had any words, then fell into this quote-unquote autistic spectrum, 100% it was going to be immune or viral. Now, to show you how absolute that is, remember again, first part of the discussion today, there's only certain ways the brain can go wrong there, okay? If a child developed normally the first 12, 15, 18 months of life, had no words, 99% it was immune or viral, and no researcher there had another viable mechanism to explain it. That should say a lot to you guys. Now, this girl started on whole milk, of course, at 1 year old. Parents became concerned. She was not developing language. I mean, this is a common story that I could tell you over and over again in the practice. In her case, they were out of Washington, D.C. They had the benefit of going to the Naval Medical Center. They were trying to figure out what was wrong with this girl. They ran a whole bunch of tests on her, but nobody thought in the directions we're talking about. When I met him, She was a child. Now, again, your children present with different blood markers, but if you take a look here, this was her initial blood work. Now remember, she was worked up at a naval hospital, supposedly pretty high-powered people there, but they didn't think this direction at all. She had an interferon alpha of 439. Now, for the record, interferon alpha means you have an active virus in your body to prove it otherwise. All that would have taken was one simple test to maybe get them to look further. As we went along, and again, the kind of markers I see with your children, I'll use this as a general discussion, her NK cells, and this is true of your children, fluctuated. She didn't start off in a bad range. Along the range, she was lower. Her alpha interferon, if you look, dropped to normal. She had a high ASO titer. Remember, we talked about that, connected to pandas. Now, one other thing that you, again, are all being deceived on. In this case, she presented with a normal folate and a slightly elevated vitamin B12. Lesson back to that 1992 NIH meeting. If the immune system is off, the mitochondria are off. When the mitochondria are off, your cholesterol, triglyceride metabolism is off, your vitamin B metabolism is off, and so are, as I said, about 100 other processes. When I don't generally do it, but if I run blood work on your children and check B12 folic acid, if they've not been on supplements, one or the other will be high, and if they've been on supplements, they'll both be off the chart. Now, again, the people giving that advice, somewhere it goes back 30, 40 years. Oh, your children aren't absorbing B vitamins right. Forgive me, it's the other way around. They're not utilizing those vitamins correctly, but that doesn't mean I'm going to fix that by pouring a whole bunch more of that in the body. In pediatrics, you're taught, if you're not processing it, I throw a bunch of that in there, where do you think it's going to go? It backs up. Even though there's a wider range of safety on the B vitamins, they still become toxic to the brain and body in too much. She had, in this case, this child had a normal ferritin. Now, this is one of the tests I run routinely on your children. I see these children come in on multiple supplements, multiple things to help them, and no iron. Many of your children, this child was fine. I get kids coming in with irons of 5, 10, 12. We now expect a ferritin to be 35 to 40. When I was in training, 15 or 20 was okay. For the record, iron alone helps the body tremendously. I could give you in my practice baby after baby. I fortunately was in my internship residency, was very heavily oriented. Dr. Frank Oski at that time was a major pediatric hematologist. He ultimately became head of Johns Hopkins Medical School, so we're talking about a high-powered person. And he taught me that many children are iron deficient who are not anemic. I could tell you over and over the number of children giving them a little extra iron. The head grew better, the body grows better. This is a key nutrient to everything your children need, and that's not usually in any of the supplements your kids get. Now, this is this girl's SPECT scan. This is, again, going to a next level of scans, by the way. December 98, and this is her scan 3 years later. And I don't know, this is not normal, but I hope you can tell how much more that brain is red, perfused, and looking better. This is her scan 1298. Now, I want to qualify this. Dr. Mina does not like this view. What they did is they can take technology and literally, with the scanner, make an image of your brain. If you think about it, amazing technology. The problem is, if you took the brain out of the body, you would not see all these holes in here, okay? Those holes, think of it, are perfusion deficit areas. Okay, the way the scan does it is areas that are underperfused show up as these holes. And if you look, this kid has holes all over her brain. As I've tried to say to you, this is not a benign process. While it's focal mainly in the temporal lobe cerebellum, it's affecting many parts of the brain. You could almost imagine a virus living in those areas. Now, as I've had many researchers tell me, This is about as close as you can come to black and white proof this is changeable. Now, unfortunately, and this is part of my frustration, this girl, while doing better, went on to develop a seizure disorder. You can see, look at the damage to her brain. Look at those irritable foci. So even though we have her moving forward, unfortunately, we have the complications of what went on for a long time. This is a case of mine many years ago, a girl that presented with what was called quiet ADD. Now again, many of you may hear these stories. This was a child who was getting basically A's or B's, and by 4th grade, 5th grade, grades started dropping. Finally, I think in 6th grade, good old D's and F's. I met her, it was my early years of doing this, said, let me run some blood work on her. Sure enough, she fit into this. This is her scan a little over a year later. For the record, this is the only normal scan I'm going to put up there today totally. And look at the difference in blood perfusion. See these temporal lobes in here? See the cerebellum? This is what is affecting your children, not some new form of mercury toxicity, not some congenital disorder. There is a shutdown of blood flow that is immune-mediated and bluntly can be changed. I'd also like to present this child. This is, again, an early child, but it illustrated things. Unfortunately, this was a regular child in my practice. Like many teenagers, I saw him 15 years old, and then he didn't come back till 18 years old. When I saw him back, I find out that he essentially is flunking out of school. The father wants to throw him out of the house. You get all the adjectives, unmotivated, lazy, etc., etc. You guys have all heard those before. This is this child's scan 1 year later. Again, this is not a normal scan, but it is a lot healthier. By the way, one of the negatives on this scan, Dr. Mina read what he calls scalloping. That's literally like a thinning of the brain going on, okay? Now, for the record, this child then put himself through junior college, did so well that the dad decided he should help him, and he is presently out in the business world, a very successful adult. Think of the stories you're used to and what could have happened to that child. So, the problem is, what do we do now? Okay, I mean, there's two steps. First off, if we want to say what we're going to do now, I have said, I hope pleasantly to Kay, Shona, and others, it's time for revolution, you guys. That may not be the right words to use nowadays in the world, but either we get enough parents to say enough is enough, and we help to focus the medical system in the right way, or, as I will show you by a few slides later on, even though the data's out there, even though the logic is out there, your children are going to wait a few more decades for any real change. That is unacceptable. So, in turn, my approach has really been evolving over what for me is 20 years plus. Now, I do believe in food elimination regimens, but not for the reasons you guys are given. This is not celiac disease. When you tell the medical profession your kids have celiac disease, they shut you off. They're not going to listen to you because they know it's not true. But if I qualify it, your children have a very reactive immune system. Number one allergen in the world is dairy. Number two allergen in the world is wheat. If I take a child, what I call the do's and don'ts of diet, and I believe this is up on my website for you guys, I am strict about wanting a child off of dairy. I want them off of whole grains, and whole foods in some way. I'll explain this to you in a moment. But I don't mind usually if they have a piece of white bread for a sandwich. I don't want that child sitting there eating a loaf of bread. That's not going to do them any good. But they can have white bread for a sandwich. I have only a few children in my practice who, when they go entirely gluten-free, casein-free, are better. And again, I will qualify it. That is not celiac disease. It's still just a matter of how reactive, how sensitive they are to those products. Now, a mother asked me a question. One of the places that, again, unfortunately, you and many others are being deceived. I do run a food screen on your children, But what I tell a parent, there is not a food test in the world that is totally accurate. You can do old-fashioned, what we call IgE RAS testing. RAS has a big problem. If it's positive, you're allergic. But if it's negative, it doesn't mean you're not sensitive or have a problem with that food. You can do different new sensitivity tests out there. But again, I get very frustrated as a pediatrician when I see parents come in and, you know, whoever they went to has said, well, this and this and this is what your child's allergic to. The food screen doesn't prove that alone. It gives you triggers. So what I've done is, for me, it's 20 years of evolution. I start by no milk or dairy, no chocolate, no whole wheat. Most of your children, I want no strawberries, no cherries, no berries, okay? They are both allergenic, and they're very likely to hype your children up. Now again, the medical profession, and I'm trying to say this because if we're going to succeed, we need to bring the medical profession and I'll dare say the politicians into this thing, but correctly. We made jokes. Someone asked me, we had hyperactive children, you know, many, many years ago, and I don't know how many of you heard of the Feingold diet. That was the concept that these hyperactive kids, you take away sugar, you take away red dyes, and other things. I told most parents that you accomplished most of what that diet was going to do by taking away the sugars if a kid was truly a hyperactive kid. But over the years, I have found myself more and more restricting children on the red fruits, at least, and the berries. Now, as it turns out, there was it's like, if you look at this, I've learned the hard way. Medicine will not accept something till it's proven. You know, we knew for years that certain kids got hyper on certain foods. We knew for years that dairy was a major problem. But I was literally, and I'll say this openly, when I was first in practice, I was borderline a quack to tell a parent to stop dairy. Now, things change. When the American Academy of Pediatrics and Research showed that what we politely call bovine protein, it works in the body as a super antigen. That's a polite way of saying it can trigger off that immune system in ways you wouldn't believe, including making the immune system attack the pancreas and causing diabetes. Now, as soon as that was confirmed, proven, then and only then the Academy started telling mothers to take kids off of dairy. If a kid had eczema, breakout, stop dairy. They've actually gone so far as to say a family with high atopy, the mother during the pregnancy should be off of dairy, whole wheat, whole grains. Now, I want to digress here a little bit. I could make a very strong hypothesis. I won't call this fact yet, but hypothesis, that one of the reasons we are seeing so many problems in adults and children is because of our philosophy in the 60s or 70s. How many of us grew up with the idea that we wanted to eat healthy, natural, unprocessed foods? We've all been told that, right? Now, little problem. Maybe if we were living in the world of 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago, that would be very good advice. But in the world we live in, the simple common denominator to understand this is you are looking at a lot of adults and a lot of children who are predisposed to that immune reactivity. Now, learning lesson as a pediatrician. If I took a young kid, now again, I will stress this, I was always taught by this allergist immunologist, who obviously was a few years ahead of his time, that I avoid exposing those children to certain foods till they got older, okay? So I always followed a very restricted plan of introducing foods. You also learn very fast as a pediatrician, if I give that kid healthy, natural, organic baby food, that kid was going to go off the wall. I can't tell you how many children come in that the mothers have sincerely tried to feed them healthy food without realizing all that healthy food is sending that kid's immune system off the wall. So what I hope can be done is get back to practicality. You introduce foods to a child appropriately. You start being cautious about what your choices are. And I certainly believe in good nutrition, but we got to get away from the ideal that just because something is organic or natural, it makes it good. Again, I'm going to digress and show how much this has changed. One of the mothers in the practice has 2 kids I work with who are extremely allergic. I mean, I've had to chase what are called eosinophils on them, you know, and try to keep figuring out what's going on. But she has some medical background. So we had a nice conversation. Unfortunately, her father had been ill, and she was in a hospital in Orange County, and corners, again, this is a sharp mom, corners a pediatric immunologist. We were laughing because she spent a half an hour talking to that pediatric immunologist. 10 years ago, he would have thrown her out of his office, and he told her more things than I did about the foods, including the fact that they are having tremendous problem with organic meats. Do you know why? What are they feeding those cows? Whole wheat, whole grains. It's actually going through the meat. Now, believe me, as much as I believe in foods, I would have personally said that was crazy. You take the meat, you cook it, should be fine, right? I have a patient, my learning lesson was a patient in Singapore who, again, part of it is tracking diet, figuring out what the allergies are. They started feeding their child milk-fed veal, and the allergies went up like that. So you can't use any blanket statement that because something's organic or something is natural, it's going to be good for your children. In fact, most of the time, it's going to be a negative. What you do want is healthy food, healthy eating. We'll go into it and cover it with questions, but you want a high-protein diet. I will always tell parents, you want fruits, but at least in your children, till they are well, until their immune systems are normal, you are better off avoiding what are basically non-North American fruits. You don't want tropical fruit. You don't want, in this case, they are North American, but you don't want cherries, strawberries, the berries. Just taking things out of the diet will help your children tremendously. That's a simple step you can take. One of my learning lessons over all the years, it's not how much I can throw into your child's body, it's how do you clean up the body. And this applies, by the way, to adults. As I said, they were all megadosed, they were all given all these supplements, they were all given these ideals of let's help your immune system, and you know what? 99% of the time it didn't work because the supplements out there are not clean, they're not pure, and you have a greater chance of pushing the wrong buttons than you do the right ones. Now, one more step. I want to use this. Because again, old ideas seem to have a very hard time of dying out there. I, again, was open to nutrition. When I first told you about I was going to work with those vitamins, amino acids, I went up to a Dr. Ben Kagan, who literally is an icon in pediatrics. I'm very fortunate he was one of my mentors. Now, again, food is a touchy issue in medicine. So I go up to him and say, Ben, a friend of mine wants to consider using vitamins, amino acids for ADHD. He looks at me and says, Mike, we tried that we tried that in 1930s in Boston, it didn't work. Now, again, what's being done out there? What I did learn is you don't have any chance of it working if it's not a pharmaceutical-grade product. The safest thing for your children from the health food stores is most of the stuff doesn't get absorbed. It doesn't get past the liver. It doesn't get into the body. And that's probably protecting some of your children. But I want many of you to realize the medical world will do anything appropriate to try to help your children if we point them in the right direction, but it's not going to re-go over old ideas that it know failed before. Now, I will use antivirals, antifungals. And again, I want to illustrate what a fine line this is. If I went around to any of the researchers I work with, if I gave a talk like this, and I said, your children are autistic because they have yeast, those researchers I work with and count on would never talk to me again. Because that would be one of the most ridiculous statements I could have come out of my mouth. If I qualify myself very carefully that we know from work in adults, a little bit in teenagers, that when you are in these kind of immune states, what is called delayed hypersensitivity is off. That is the part of your immune system that deals with fungi and yeast. So if I very carefully say I'm working with the immune system, I'm using an antifungal because of that, I can get by because that's medically correct. But what I want you to realize is what's happening out there. Many doctors are saying, oh, we're going to go after the immune system, or oh, your children have yeast and fungi. But they don't understand 1 minute that those aren't the original problems and this is a disease. And that's what's going to either help you guys or do you in, because if people don't change, you're stuck in the trap you've been in. Antivirals have had a tremendous place right now. In fact, if I say that anything for me has changed in the last 10 years, when I came into this, again, I was used to the idea of neuroimmune. I knew we were seeing activated viruses, but the number of your children with activated viruses has been almost unbelievable to me. And as I said, testing, unfortunately, is not perfect. I can test for HHV6. I can't even measure reliably yet. HHV7, HHV8. So in turn, at this stage, if I have a child who presents with motor issues, history of regression, history of abnormal EEG, even if the blood work looks normal, I'm going to give that child a trial on an antiviral, and probably more times out of not, it will turn out that there is something there. Now, how do you know something's there? This is actually what helped me get some of the researchers I work with to begin to listen. Again, what I've tried to explain out there, I know the medical system. I know its good points, its negative points. And unfortunately, I've watched for 20 years as adults have battered chronic fatigue syndrome, been led by people doing things that have been done to all your kids, and guess what? After 20 plus years, they do not have one straight therapy for chronic fatigue syndrome. When I came into this, I was hoping, praying, it would not happen to your children. But I've watched your children fall into the same traps. Now, again, I'm hoping we're going to change that. The thing that has been shocking is the antivirals, because what this is saying is while you're being told, I said this earlier, oh, your kids have a passive encephalopathy, they were born this way, you've got a virus in many of these children slowly eating at their brain. Look at that girl's pictures I showed you before. This is not benign, and we need to get the medical system to join in and help. But you're only going to get there if literally they stop hearing all the wrong stuff and they start hearing the logic. Now, I will use, as I said earlier, SSRIs, other appropriate pharmaceuticals. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm, again, a pediatrician. I didn't start off saying, oh, I want to give your children SSRIs because they're all depressed out there. In fact, I would never do that. What I learned, and again, this all goes back clinical and now supported by the research. These adults have the same problem your kids have. They couldn't sleep. They wake up tired. Remember my comment? There's no sleeping pill you can take that induces a normal stage 4 REM sleep cycle, for the record. Okay, they're working on that, but I have not heard of it being developed yet. In turn, late 80s, early 90s, I heard of these adults being put on this new antidepressant Prozac and sleeping better, waking up rested the next morning. That was my first interest to say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because again, don't forget, the SSRIs were the new wonder drugs. Instead of Valium, Librium, things that were around when we were all growing up, these didn't target the whole brain, they didn't sedate the whole brain, they worked on one mechanism, that's serotonin selective reuptake. So that got me to say, okay, what's going on here? My wife then pulls literature like that out of the FDA. I became convinced that this would be something that in theory would be safe for your children. And then around then I was getting into the spec work and everything came together. If the temporal lobe is off, it turns out the temporal lobe is primarily serotonin mediated. So if I can take an agent that was invented as a selective antidepressant, but I can help that area of a child's brain work right. In other words, realize, underperfused means underfunction, okay? So imagine that that part of the brain is trying to do what it can, is certainly releasing some serotonin, but it's not working right. So if I can take what is there and make it stay around longer, I'm going to help that part of the brain. And that's the only goal with an SSRI. You don't medicate a kid to control them. If there's a negative, now this is the other learning experience. As I said, I will only use on the children what are called the simple SSRIs: Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa. Now, in psychiatry, you're taught someone comes in depressed, you may give them an SSRI, and when they do poorly, oh, now we'll change class of meds. We'll go to tricyclics, or we'll go to something heavier. My learning experience on this has been, first off, I wouldn't go to the heavier meds, so that wasn't even in consideration. But what my learning experience has been fascinating. I have educated reasons for what I do, but to this minute, there is not a test in existence that tells me ahead of time what is the best SSRI for that child. I always start low. I always adjust things. If I see a negative reaction, I switch. But over the years, it's been a very, very interesting learning experience about your children. I'll have a child, especially some of the older kids, by the way, where this really comes in. I'll go to work with them with an SSRI, and it's like their tolerance is tiny. I mean, if I go beyond that, I'm throwing that child off, okay? And again, part of what I do as a pediatrician is I want to make sure that I'm helping that child brighter, sharper. Nothing I want to give them do I want to induce a negative. And for the record, the other part of that is you can only do one thing at a time. Again, anybody who tells you, go give your kid this and this and this, walk out of that office. Because as much as I'm a pediatrician, as much as I've worked with this, I couldn't begin to figure your children out clinically if I didn't do step by step to know what I was doing. So another simple point of advice, anyone who says do 3 or 4 things at one time, forget it. They're not going to know what's really going on with your kids. Now, what evolved out of all this is that I do believe in, let's call it, forgive me, let me go back 1 second. So what happened was, I learned that, especially with the older kids, I had to go slow many times, some of the younger kids too. But what gets really interesting is parents, in fact, there's a NIDS list out there that I hope many of you will join. It's in the Yahoo groups, it's called NIDS. And I've had parents come in, and we leave it an open group. It is not censored, it is not controlled. I mean, for the record, many of you may want to know that most autistic groups out there, if someone wants to make a posting that doesn't agree with the group, it doesn't get up there. You guys are not allowed to be exposed to the real truth or the real answers. So the idea of the NIDS list was, you know, good or bad, people can put up there what they want. But very nicely, I had a mother, a new patient one day, say, you know, you're the only list out there that people are talking about recovered children. I said, thank you. Again, key to all of this, though, the brain changes. There was, again, parents say, hey, how come Dr. Goldberg's spending the summer changing around SSRIs on a group of children? Well, the reason I'm doing that, if I have a kid where I want them, if they're totally bright, totally alert, waking up fresh in the morning, doing well in school, I'm very happy. But if I have a kid that's doing well, but isn't all the way there, I'll joke with a parent, I'm a perfectionist. I want the best I can do for that child. And many times, not only will I change SSRI, but what I've learned is I may go back to an SSRI that 3 years ago or 2 years ago wasn't so great, now works very well. How come? The brain has changed. You do the right thing here, the brain is maturing, and what it needs or what is the right step does change with time. Now, where I'm not opposed to, if we could make the supplement industry do pharmaceutical grade products, make them in normal dosing for children. I will remain totally opposed to ever giving a child something that is beyond physiologic dosing, okay? But if we could get the industry to give you clean products, I would certainly not be opposed to saying good basic nutrition belongs in there, okay? But I am totally opposed to anything resembling megadosing, chelation, hyperbaric, with at least 99.9999% of your children. How come? People giving you this advice, many of them were not doctors to start with, by the way, which is very sad. Many of them are not pediatricians, but many of them have also forgotten basic medicine. Oxygen is toxic. First lesson as a pediatrician, we gave a baby too much oxygen and they got blind. If you look at this report, they're making a strong statement. Neonatologists would be well thought of to think of oxygen as a medication. Now, unfortunately, I had a new patient that illustrated the worst of my horror stories. I always knew all the way along the idea of hyperbaric was a mistake. Again, oxygen is toxic. It induces radicals that can harm the body. But the worst of my nightmares came true when I had a new patient who had gone through the hyperbaric in Florida, had a SPECT scan done that was one of the worst I've ever seen, but it was done. And then after the hyperbaric, they did a repeat SPECT scan, and they go, look, Mom, look how much better it is. The child's brain was white. Essentially, you were over-perfusing those areas. You were killing off brain cells, and they're telling this mom, take a look how good this is. You know, what everyone seems to be forgetting, yes, we have parts of the brain underperfused, but I have never seen anyone tell me that they're going to take hyperbaric and get it just to those areas. They get it to the normal areas. It's not like the whole brain is off. Part of the brain is working normally. So you're actually going to potentially harm cells in those healthy parts of the brain. Now, again, everyone acts like you can just throw things into your children's bodies and it's okay. I want to illustrate to you a few more cautions. GABA, which is part of the mechanism that is looked at, some of the supplements influence that. Think about this a moment. In an adult brain, new neurons are generated from stem cells, okay? In an infant, GABA reduces that proliferation of stem cells. Unless this is properly studied, who in the world can tell you that giving the child that supplement is helping them versus hurting them? You know, people act like something's natural. It's not a medicine, so we can just do it. But you've got to realize you're playing around with children's physiology. If those groups want to do it, then where are their studies? Where are their scans? Where's their evidence that they're helping your children and not hurting them? It turns out, again, as we learn more, this is an article showing glutamic acid, glutamatic dysfunction in OCD. They present preliminary evidence, glutamic excess in the pathology of OCD. Now, get ready for this. Remember we talked about OCD and immune system? What they're showing here is in tiny amounts, okay, they could induce stereotypic and limbic seizures in higher amounts. They could throw things off in low amounts. Again, I would respectfully say to every one of you as parents, who has any right to tell you what to throw into your children if they have not themselves studied and give you sincere, honest data that they're not going to harm your child? Chelation, let's come back to that. I talked about mercury before. Let's come back to chelation. In essence, despite years of investigation, as I said, there is no evidence that mercury has anything to do with ASD. This is how you guys as parents, hopefully the professionals out there understand this, are misled. Okay, you have something affecting the brain, you have another thing affecting the brain, but it's totally misleading to you to tell you a list of symptoms of different disorders and assume the causes are the same. Extensive toxicological literature indicates that mercury, unlike lead and arsenic, remains in the body for only a brief time. It's eliminating through the urine and stool, generally meaning that there's no indication for chelation, and clinical experience shows that chelation therapy for any type of metal poisoning does not reverse neurological injury. Now, let me show you how extensive that is. Again, the people giving you this advice, I would challenge any of you to say, where's their literature, where's their data? What we do know in Pediatrics, which is the main journal for pediatricians, they did a study, forgive me, I lose track of time real easy, probably 5 years ago, 7 years ago now, on lead toxicity and chelation. Now, all of us are taught lead is toxic. There's no debate by anyone. Lead is a heavy metal, and lead is toxic, right? Now, in medical school, I was taught that you would consider chelating your child at 15 to 20. Now, the literature says consider chelation at 60 to 80. Know why? Because what they found in controlled studies was the kids that were chelated did no better than the kids that were not chelated, and in some cases did even worse. So please think about this. You're being told to put a potentially toxic substance in your child's body, and unless someone shows you and proves to you in a children's hospital that your kid really has heavy metal toxicity, it's a huge mistake. There is another flaw in this theory. Those who support chelation contend that mercury in autism is tightly bound to proteins, not easily eliminated from the body. You know, you hear again these ideas out there. This is a new form of mercury poisoning, okay? Well, wait a minute. If mercury is so tightly bound, how's it causing any symptoms? As I explained to you, I could do a stimulation test on every one of you, and the odds are pretty high I'll get some mercury out of you. But that doesn't mean it's doing anything to hurt you, and it doesn't mean that nature is not taking care of it for you. Now, everyone says again, they worry about medicines. When I came into this, people looked at me like, how could I use medicines on children? Flip it around. I won't use any medication that I can't tell a parent that if I monitor it, I follow that child is going to be safe. There's no hidden harm, no hidden dangers, and again, I monitor children very carefully. But everything natural is supposed to be fine, right? Well, think about it. Chelation is a very invasive treatment. Its potential for toxicity is real, and very key point, it is unlikely that providing nutritional supplements while conducting chelation therapy will prevent the loss of all essential micronutrients. I don't know how much of you understand, but what is the purpose? What does chelation do? You put into the body a product. It doesn't go after mercury or lead alone. It goes after plus ions. Lead is plus, mercury is plus. But guess what? So is calcium, so is magnesium, so are other important ions in your body. As a pediatrician, we are taught, you have a child in intensive care unit, very ill. I'm going to be trying to regulate that child's electrolytes, body, nutrition. That's the most dangerous time in that child's life. Mother Nature can do a whole lot better job of that than us as doctors having to do it. So when people act like, oh, you can just do this to your kid, it's fine, please stop to consider, what are you really doing? And let's keep going. There is absolutely convincing evidence, I talked about this, that when you free up this inert product, it leads to increased concentrations of toxins in the central nervous system, producing more injury. Now, let me address something. You know, again, these groups out there go, well, we've never harmed a kid. We've never hurt anybody. Well, let's get back one step. A child died about 10 days, 12 days ago from chelation. I don't know how many of you read that or heard that. But let's leave that behind. If you think of this as autism, how are you going to define damage or injury? We're not looking at an endpoint that says bright, alert child. Who knows how much damage has been done to those children short of death? If the outcome is the kid is still autistic and they've improved, in the world of hysteria called autism, parents will go for that. The poor child that died, the mother says she thinks there was improvement the first couple of treatments. But if you understand, what are we talking about by improvement? If a child has autism, any improvement is better than nothing. If a child has a disease, nothing is acceptable except getting back to a well child. And so what I will say is if, and again, by the way, hair, urine, blood, none of them are totally accurate. But the key is, if you really think your child has heavy metal of any kind, don't let anybody do anything to your children without going to a children's hospital, seeing a metabolic specialist there, a toxicologist, and then only act if they confirm there's really a problem. So what does all this mean? If these children are not brain damaged to begin with, they can learn, they can be helped, they can return to essentially normal or even above normal function, but you still have some major problems out there. This was an editorial in Forbes magazine, June 6, 2005. A patient sent it to me and said, "Hey, Mike, take a look at this." In that, they discussed the fact that we need to start using biology, not only behavior, to evaluate your children. And admits we will not find effective cures for autism until we add biological markers. And admits that what we call autism today is likely 2, 3, or more different disorders. But here's the problem. Ending paragraph. Perhaps in a few decades, when a young child begins to exhibit autistic symptoms, a physician will order blood tests and brain scans. Please forgive me. Your children do not have 2 decades to wait. And what this reflects and what has to change is the people in charge, even good researchers, are not understanding the switch. About 3 or 4 months ago, there was a big news again in the autistic world. Oh, look, we found an immune connection to autism. Again, I will hold to all of you. Everything I've said today, I'll dare say things I presented 10 years ago are being supported. But that same night, I live in the West Coast, that same night, Dr. Amaral comes on from the Mind Institute. Well, now we hope we will develop a test to pick up your children sooner in 5 or 10 years. Again, please forgive me, but unless the people focusing and working with your children understand they don't have 5 or 10 years. This is not autism like something happened and it's now locked in steel that these children have autism. This is an ongoing disease process, and if the world, I really believe this, maybe I'm being naive, but I really believe that if the medical system, Congress, the people that count, hear the truth, if you guys can help throw the switch, this is a disease, this is not a developmental disorder, you're going to see an entire change in what's done for your children. Now, part of the problem, remember I said it's a problem. I pulled down a recent PubMed search. Again, as I tell people, I go to the literature. Now let's take a look. This was the top 15 articles on a recent search. Going to study autism in a twin, perseverative development in young children, one slightly medical article, secretin, although we've already proven secretin doesn't work, pharmacological management of agitation and aggression. Well, again, this is where the medical system is wrong. If your kids have a developmental disorder, we're going to look at controlling their aggression. Problems in children of normal intelligence with PDD. How many of you know that when Kanner originally described this, he described your children as above average in intelligence? You know, they were coming from these cold, unnurturing mothers, but he himself recognized that these were bright, intelligent families. Where did we throw that switch that says a child with autism is retarded? It's a totally wrong conception. Just look at you guys as parents. Look at where these kids are coming from, and nobody would have expected to have a kid that was below average. Now, keep going. Window on development of social analytical brain. A medical article. Immunological etiology of major psychiatric disorders. Good, we have a medical point there. Effect of directive, non-directive prompts on compliance. Effects of reinforcement. This is one of the other major mistakes. I don't understand why researchers do this. Links on the statistical distribution of blood serotonin as a predictor of early autistic brain abnormalities. Please forgive me, And again, I have a lot of respect for what's termed academics, but I don't understand how so many groups and so many academic people can take your funding and absolutely waste your money. Do you know for a fact that in the peripheral blood that they measure, 90% plus of that serotonin comes from platelets and other cells? Do you think what they measure out here has anything to do with what's going on in the brain? Not at all. And then, I picked the top 15. Now we get into genes. As I said to you, does anybody think that with all the money spent in the last 10 years, we've missed discovering a gene or chromosome? So this is the problem facing all of you. We are in the middle of a medical epidemic. We are in the middle of what may be a greater crisis than you can imagine, certainly greater than nature can do. But the groups you've counted on to help you, the funding that's supposed to help your children, please look at where it's being directed and ask yourselves how it's going to in any way help you solve a medical crisis. So here's what I'd like to propose. We have this vague, nebulous idea of what we call autism, ADHD, chronic fatigue syndrome. There are signs, there are symptoms, millions of dollars of research right now, and to this day, I would ask any of you, what objectively has come out of that? What I challenge a parent with, when all the experts have sat and said, your child has autism, give me one objective test that says your children have autism. They have a bunch of dysfunctional symptoms, a bunch of dysfunctional behavior. That can come from a whole lot of reasons. So what we're trying to do, I used the term earlier, NIDS, neuroimmune dysfunction syndromes. I don't care if we call this, as I said, A, B, C, D, call it anything you want. But what we need to do if we're going to help your children is bring these disorders back into the medical profession. You need immunologists, infectious disease specialists, child developmental people looking at your children, but from a disease point. So what I'm hoping we could do, if we start studying, again, you can call it anything you want. You could have definable abnormalities. You have definable markers. You can, of course, measure cognitive dysfunction by tests. And if we do this, you now have the ability to focus on new therapy applications, not 10 years from now, not 20 years from now, but right now. I would say to all of you respectfully, if these children can change, your children deserve that same chance, and hopefully we can all make that happen. I thank you very much for this opportunity. They're functioning well. Do neural spec scans on them and see like little areas scattered all over the brain where you could imagine either a vasculitis or that virus was, okay? Now in these kids, I look back on the blood work, they came in as a viral, and hopefully I'm stopping that. But yes, I think that you deal with a couple of dangers here. If there's an immune process going on, if there is a virus there, yes, there's going to be ongoing harm to the brain. Flip that around though. What many parents forget, no child is born 5 years old, 10 years old, or 15 years old. They made jokes when I was growing up, the brain is a muscle. That's absolutely the truth. One of the things, even if you have a high-functioning child, if they're not utilizing certain areas of their brain, that's not going to develop like it should, and it's going to be a problem down the line. It's only a matter of how much of a degree. I was on another radio interview, and a mother had a high-functioning daughter, 12 years old, Asperger, and what I say to any parent is in the world out there, yeah, compared to a child with severe autism, that kid's a lot better off. But if you start to understand a disease, that child deserves every bit of their brain working that we can help work. I wouldn't have made it through medical school, or college, or medical school if my brain wasn't working fully.
Okay, so it can progress.
I think what is good, again, depending upon the process, depending upon how it's going, it can progress, or it can hold back development, but either way, it's not a good situation. Now, again, I will use the questions to hit things that I didn't do in the presentation. I go back to the statement I made to all of you at UCLA. We learned about these hyperactive, hyperkinetic children who paradoxically calm down on a stimulant medication. Ritalin, Adderall wasn't around then, Dexedrine, and I will never forget the pharmacy lecture. You would never give those drugs to a teenager or adult. Well, let's go back a step. Information is hidden from all of you. 1995, Dr. Mina tells me that there's spec work out there that shows essentially there is no difference in the brain of a child giving them a dose of Ritalin or giving them a dose of cocaine. 2001, you can check this out. In the Journal of the American Medical Association, they actually acknowledged this linkage. In fact, with the statement that Ritalin was stronger than cocaine. So I would respectfully say to you, if you look at those ads out there, your brain on drugs, what are we doing to the children? Now, this is where spec comes in. On spec, we, unlike the world saying, no, you can't define ADHD, I can separate out each one of those kinds of ADHD on spec. The old-fashioned hyper-ADD child, they have increased blood flow in their frontal lobe, essentially a normal rest of the brain. Now, I might be opposed to it, but I could argue, well, at least in those kids, maybe there's a limited place for the idea of the stimulant medications, okay? But when you look at all the children out there with mixed ADD, quiet ADD, autistic presentations, PDD, what you've got already is a lowering of blood flow in parts of the brain. You give that child a stimulant med, you're actually dumbing down parts of the brain they need to develop. Huge mistake. This is the big problem, and you fit right into it, unfortunately. What we've done out there is create an alphabet soup. It's kind of like how your kid develops, we'll give them a new label, okay? One of the problems is you have to, again, go back in medicine. Where did all this start? Remember I said we didn't think these problems were medical, so we put them into psychology, psychiatrist. I literally attended an ASA meeting, I don't waste my time anymore, and listened to their experts define how these children were coming out of the woodwork, did not fit classic autistic profiles, but when they were done, they put them in this big basket called autism. So as you've lived through with your son, depending upon what his level of dysfunction is, you get a label. Now, the big question is at the end, what do you do to help? This has been my frustration, and I'll be blunt here. I'll unequivocally tell you, you can go back and read articles I wrote in 94, 95 about this. You could go back and read articles I wrote about chronic fatigue syndrome in the 80s, and I do not personally believe there's anything I have to retract. It's improved from then, it maybe evolved from then, but my whole philosophy was always data, facts. Now, part of my goal in being here today, we are about to get help at getting a centers set up that will be neurospec centers so we can link the data. Again, try to skip ahead a decade or two for all of you. Optimistically, I'm fine. My difficulty has been I'm a private physician. I don't get a university stipend. I don't have a university tenure. I'm a private doctor. But what I'm hoping is going to happen is I'm about to get the help I need to let me begin to focus more time at helping to train other physicians to do what I've been doing and to start to make available to all of you other choices. What I would say meantime, again, unfortunately, I know this can't happen instantaneously, but one, take your child, any child out there, bluntly, you would be better off if all you did, until we get a system doing more for you, if you did dietary eliminations, healthy diet, high protein, low carbs, have your pediatrician check for iron, because many of these children are low in iron. Again, with the literature out there, many pediatricians even will consider a low-dose SSRI. Now, if you can go the next step, you try to get them to draw a little more blood. Some of the kids, not every child, but some of the kids will be floridly a viral situation. Hopefully they refer you to an infectious disease specialist. But what you need to do is get away from autistic experts. They're not telling you what you need to know about your children. So if you take this talk we've given today, you start focusing on the science. Part of my hope is, there are many, many good people here motivated. If we can start to make the right focus and get the momentum, I believe we can break through this. I believe that the right voices can hear what's going on. And I also believe with optimism right now, we're going to get the help, that there'll be a way of getting the right help out there for most of you. That would bring me to another patient I saw. I had a mother bring in a child, this was a 4 or 5-year-old child, who was literally on a feeding tube taking Pediasure, okay? Kid was severe hypotonia. Again, that's what you see in some of your children. Flaccid. And I started working with her. And fortunately, I think she was from the Cincinnati area, and one of the researchers in Children's Hospital was being very supportive. And then I get a call, okay, on a Friday afternoon, almost an emergency. The child has reflexes. Do I need to work him up for a tumor? This is not what the medical world expects to happen. A kid that's flaccid, hypotonic, when they get reflexes, we worry about a brain tumor. I said, thankfully, I think the child's responding to therapy, and I don't think you have to worry that way. And for the record, that child with a feeding tube is now eating normally, is walking around, and developing motor-wise. So, in a sense, I believe this can change for you. I believe it can change for others. My only hope is how fast can we get people out there to help make a change. One is, I do not believe right now in existence is any alternative that will do exactly what the SSRIs will do. Part of the challenge here is again, what I learned with your children, you start getting that older kid acting like a 2 or 3-year-old child, okay? If I didn't know what I was putting in their body each morning, I would have no way of separating out as a pediatrician, what am I doing, what's the kid doing? Unfortunately, there are no other agents that work exactly like the SSRIs. But that concern has no bearing. First off, what are some of these psychological disorders? Again, they're labels, they're names. Who knows what they mean? 2, when I talk about SSRIs, you're always coming from a low dose and working up. If I see a child get zony, spacey, that should hopefully go away in 7 or 10 days. It's usually a good sign, by the way. It's almost like you're turning on tracks in the brain and it's starting to connect. You adjust. If you're starting to see a kid doing well and then they're irritable, cranky, you back down a little bit, okay? If the SSRI is started and a child's hyper, I change SSRIs. Bluntly, working through that, I usually can find something that's going to be there and work. And the past history means very little, because what do those diagnoses mean in your family? One is, and this is the difficult part, like right now, we're in a world that if you choose as parents to do diet eliminations, most doctors will either say, oh, I don't believe in it, or they'll go along with you. They're not going to give you any trouble. Hopefully, writing an SSRI they may even go along with, because like I said, the only studies out there that show help for your children are based on SSRI. Unfortunately, when you ask me what do I think is a major part of that therapy, the antiviral has probably become one of the major steps. I just, again, leaving my office the other day, had a follow-up with a family that I met a month ago. Both children, they were basically ADHDs, PDD, Asperger variants, okay? One child I had, because of the history, I had started on an antiviral. The other child I had done diet and antifungal with. Both children were heading off to school and the teachers couldn't believe their attitude, their cooperation, their desire. What I keep learning, I have a child, another ADHD child. The father comes in about a year after I've been treating the child, kind of in a nice way, goes, I didn't want my wife bringing my children to you. I want to thank you. And in this case, their son, who was turning into this obnoxious, I'm not going to do anything lazy kid, he had viral titers like this. All I literally had to do was put him on antiviral, and he changed completely. So the frustrating part of this is I think right now, the whole picture is important. But if I narrow it down to diet elimination and SSRI, and hopefully getting your doctor to perhaps at least do a few viral screening tests. Things do change in the world of medicine. And one of the shocking things for me recently is in a pediatric journal, there was a case of a 14-year-old girl who had what we call fulminant hepatitis. That means a very fast, severe hepatitis, okay? it was due to HHV6. Now, for the record, in what I've been involved in, that was of no surprise to me. But what was a surprise, and this is a pediatric journal learning lesson, half of febrile seizures in children are due to HHV6. Now, if that is even remotely true, again, I'm a pediatrician. We grew up like a child had a benign febrile seizure. There was no reason for it. It was an immature brain. Well, now, how many of those children are going to have a virus sitting in their brain? This is not okay. Back to your other question. I'm not going to sit here or stand here and tell you every child in my practice is normal and perfect. I have many, many children who are not where I'd like them to be all the way. But what I have found over the years is my limitations are not principle or ideas. The limitations are, do I have the medical tools to do what I need to do? And two, do I have an educational system that's going to do what I need to do? Because I can get a child's brain working, maybe, again, not always as good as I'd like, but working. And yet, if the therapist, the people working with that child, don't go back and start to rehabilitate that child, I learned the hard way. I started into this, had a number of children on the East Coast that were doing at a level where I know their brains are working, where they're doing better. And 3-4 years later, they're still social mental cripples because they were being taught by people who didn't change what they were doing. So I really believe this. One is, any child can be helped. And when I say that to you, I mean it. For the record, you always hear, when I came into this, all I heard were the horror stories about your children and adolescents, okay? I do not have one child in my practice who has had to be placed in a group home. Not one. And what has come across all the time is if I can help that child think, if I can get the brain working, I may have a harder time with an older child than a younger child. The older kids, by the way, are hard to judge because, again, this is physiology. If their brain was shut down the whole way, or they had a virus, there may be significant damage. But if they were partly functioning, partly not, they may have a lot of potential. The trouble is, again, one of my discussions, early summer. Mother in Philadelphia. Her child's 12, 13, doing about first grade work right now. Has been with me 2 or 3 years. Definitely at that point where this kid is ready to move forward. She tells me they're going to take the kid out in the community and help him and learn to count change. Now, my comment to this mother was, your son is 12 or 13. He's doing about first grade work. If all we did was achieve 1 year of educational gain between now and 19 or 20, you would have a child doing 7th, 8th grade work. He could do very well in that community, and I assure you he could count change. If you do what the system's going to do, we'll be lucky if that kid's doing 2nd, 3rd grade work in 6 years. I don't care whether he can count change or not, he will not make it in the community. So part of this discussion is we need to focus on the medical, but we need to get the educational developmental system to help your children. And I mean what I have said to you in a nice way. People make jokes. I have found better success for my kids in the Midwest and the South than I have on the East Coast. You don't need people doing $40,000 or $60,000 a year of ABA on your children. I mean, this was the mistake the East Coast made. Kids are in New York, New Jersey, and they were so advanced. Oh, we're going to do ABA for everybody. Well, again, as I tried to point out, if a child is totally spaced out, totally zoned out, totally ill, I don't like it. But maybe, as many people are doing modified ABA, much less aversive, maybe there's a place for that. But if we can get a kid thinking, there is no place for ABA. That started with cat and dog training. Your children are children. We need to get back to reality. So what I have experienced, one is, you guys are actually more open in Mississippi and the South here than the East Coast. So don't put yourselves down, and I mean that. Any joke I make, the jokes were like you know, the Midwest and the South. You guys are in some ways ahead, believe me. And number two, again, I couldn't have said this a month ago. I believe we're about to get the help that will let me do what I've been wanting to do, which is have, again, spec centers, niche treatment centers and shift me more from just seeing patients to helping other doctors do this. There is no reason in the world why this can't become one of those centers here. What I believe has got to occur is one is, again, with your son, just cleaning up diet, and specifically where you're at, talking to a doctor where they work with you, again, low-dose SSRI, you may pick up that temporal dysfunction and give your son a much better chance to develop social skills. Now, what I've learned, and this comes into the whole thing, if he's going to succeed, we need to help his brain working for him fully. But then you always have to go back and check, did this kid miss things at lower levels, okay? If those things are filled in, then you may find yourself guiding him for a number of years on how to improve his social whereabouts. But if we get the brain working, he can take care of that. You asked some very good questions there. First off, and I will admit, getting any teenager to cooperate on diet is more than a challenge, okay? My job has become a lot easier since I can honestly say to them, look, every time you decide to cheat, every time you decide to have that ice cream, that dairy, you're playing Russian roulette. You might do okay, you might be diabetic for the rest of your life. Helps a lot with the teenagers, okay? 2, I actually, again, the same family, they said the father came in and said about the boy. The boy comes in a few visits later, because I knew I was fighting him on allergies. I stopped dairy, I feel better, you know? Part of it is I spend a lot of time having to be upfront and telling them why they have to do it. Why does it make sense? What I usually find is if they see a gain, if they can understand what's going on, then the child might cooperate, okay? When you come to medications, this is a huge issue. As I brought up from Dr. Hyde there, if you consider that this is a hidden epidemic, how many of these kids are turning to self-medication when what we're doing isn't working? So this is part of, if we're going to help society, if we're going to have a better society 10 years from now than we have today, then we better start looking at these children and helping them in the right way, not expecting them to turn to take care of themselves. I think what's happened, and what I've begun telling parents, in other words, you talk about a pediatrician, who, by the way, will listen more than you believe if you give them the right data. If you walk up to a pediatrician and say, your son has mercury toxicity, they're not going to listen to you because they know it's wrong. If you walk up to them and tell them half the advice you're giving, they're not going to listen to you because they know it's wrong. But if you walk up to them and start becoming logical, what you can do, what I tell most parents to do, off of my website, you can download Autism and the Immune Connection. That was the first article I wrote. You can download my congressional testimony. You can download the article from with Dr. Mina that I put up here. And on the internet, you can find that Johns Hopkins article that was published in January, okay? Now, ask your doctor to read that. Then take some of my discussions with you. And here's what you need to do. Look, isn't it reasonable to think, maybe this is not true autism and I need your help with my child? Now again, if you go in there and you go data, facts, that pediatrician is, unlike 5 years ago, is more likely to listen to you today than then. But if you guys keep being given information that makes no sense, no one's going to listen. Now, flip side of it, okay? Your battles are always with your IEPs, okay? And I'm going to use that, by the way, as a nice example. Early learning lesson. I would get a child doing well, and a mother would come back from the IEP almost with her mouth open, like, they gave me everything I wanted. We have so mischaracterized the system out there. You have people in charge telling you how bad the medical world is, how bad this is and that is. My experience is just the opposite. If the educators, if the therapists, if the people that count can, one, see that a child can do better, and B, begin to understand what's at stake, they want to help you. They're not going to resist helping you. When we have the whole world telling them it's autism, I mean, every group out there is touching on immune system, and many of them are saying, oh yeah, we're going to go after immune and we're going to go after viruses. Forgive me, but most of them are multiple years behind where they should be, okay? But they all give lip service to it. A parent of mine came in for follow-up about 3 weeks ago, neurospec scan on her child from the Midwest. Her husband is a pediatrician. She tells me she went to the ASA meeting. My first words out of my mouth were a waste of time. Then she tells me everybody there is talking about immune. The problem, and this is part of what led into my attitude you're picking up a little bit and my talk today. If you look out there in the literature, in spite of the world not wanting to go this way, every piece of data is supporting the idea of the immune system. But instead of doing what they should do, immune system here, autistic symptoms over here, literally what has become obvious is they're going to stay focused on autism for as long as they can. And that's not going to help any of you. It's got to change. Yes, Michelle, as I illustrated with that other child, this has been the good news. Even though, again, my problem is getting people to, as we have discussed multiple times, getting people to work with Lindsay on what's necessary. Thankfully, my experience is in doing what I'm doing, I can openly say to any one of you now, if I've been working with a kid for 2 or 3 years, they're going to have a much healthier brain than when I started. Lindsay has a much healthier brain. What we still need to do is like that other boy I told you about. We've got to get people pushing her for oral motor language development that won't take no for an answer, and I believe that can still be done. Good question, and here's a catch-22 on that. Unfortunately, as you learn in the world of medicine, if you do anything nowadays that is not standard, your neck is out on some limb somewhere, okay? So it's reached, I will say openly, and I knew it. I was always sticking my neck out there. I guess I'm a stubborn person. But I also did it because I had ammunition behind me. Using the spec, using the researchers I worked with, I figured if I ever had a problem, I could defend it. Now, the truth is, most doctors don't have that point yet. What I've run into around the country, and this is why, again, I'm hoping we're ready to move to a next step, that I'm going to get some help so I can become potentially more of a consultant than just my direct care. But I run into all over the country, multiple doctors at this point, who will say, hey, we don't know what Dr. Goldie's doing, but it's working, we'll help you. And they won't take over management, but they'll support the parent completely. And what we need to do is go to the next step where they start feeling comfortable for what they have to do. And unfortunately, part of that is going to involve the Academy of Pediatrics, the medical system out there. Again, I cannot stress this to you guys enough. This crisis started 10 plus years ago. How many groups were formed in 95, 96 that were going to help you fix autism, okay? Maybe it's time to shift gear, because none of those groups are going to change this for you right now. But I do believe if we shift gear, we can get doctors on board, the system on board, and do a lot of different things. Let's look at this, and I'm so glad you took me this way in questions, okay? Again, let's look, all you need to understand our medical world, okay? When I trained, and I'll date myself, early 70s, I trained under physicians who, like I said, to this day are icons in pediatrics. They're some of the top people that were ever in there. I was taught to think. I was taught to try to figure out what was wrong. I was taught that we didn't know everything. You better use your brain, okay? Somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s, we started going into this HMO, controlled medicine system that eventually this was what you had to do as a doctor, okay? If someone presented with this, you did A, B, C, D, and if that didn't work, well, we're sorry, we don't know what's wrong with you, okay? So, in a sense, we got to bring the system back to thinking, all right? Now, I'm skipping over part of your question there. Please ask me again, Yeah, oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Now, do you guys think anyone, when this is still bucking the system, and I'm a clinician, okay, do you think anyone was going to fund me to do double-blind controlled studies on your children? Now, let's flip it around, and this is, I guess, the part that I was naive about. What I've tried to present to you all is logic and science. I made a mistake. I believe the medical profession, if faced with logic and science, would do their own shift, would start to look at what's going on. We have reached a world that, as you said, until there's double-blind controlled studies, they're not going to listen, even if it's real data. So what I will again say to all of you is I do believe it's time people listen. I do believe the science is there. And for the record, again, I've never asked parents to spend the money doing this, but I've had two very independent medical sources. I have a lot of data on my patients. Obviously, it goes back many years. They've all told me that if I wanted to spend the money, have them mind the practice, there'd be plenty of valid data. I'm not, and I guess this is the catch-22. You know, I'm not looking just to do those studies anymore. We're ready to move way ahead of the world, okay? We're ready to get out there and treat your children. And we'll confirm all this. Yes, in those treatment centers, everything will be controlled. You don't need to do double blind, okay, for the record, because you're not going to give children placebos. You're either going to prove you can help them or you're not. But the part I don't understand, and I know where it came from, I know how the medical system changed in the 80s and 90s, but what happened to the early 2000, you know, 1910, 1920, nothing was all double blind. You had to think as a physician. All I would ask out there, if the medical system would look at the data, they'd do the rest of it. Okay, this may be a little dangerous to have on tape, but I'll try to say it right. I was at the first stand meeting, okay? There's two things you guys need to know from that. How many of you have seen that convoluted drawing that shows how the gut, the peptides, everything feeds back on the brain? You know what drawing I'm talking about, those multiple arrows going everywhere? Okay, I was at the meeting when Dr. Gupta, who is a very excellent adult immunologist, went up to that blackboard, crossed everything out, and goes brain immune system. 2, when I stood up and said, we need controlled trials, we need controlled studies, I had to duck real fast at the arrows and darts being thrown at me. Now, this is my point to all of you. The DAN network has a tremendous amount of power. The truth is, they do not understand that immune connection. They don't understand the viral connection. And they have never produced controlled studies that are going to change the world of medicine. So bluntly, why would I waste my time talking to them? If I'm going to help you guys, we need to create sincere facts, data, and hope that we can get the medical system to change. And I'm sorry to say it, but the DAN people are never going to do that. Not the way they're going. Again, this has been my terrible learning experience. Other autistic groups were created to, again, they were going to go scientific. They were going to go logical. I would, again, respectfully say, look at where the science and logic is going. But Dr. Bruce Miller was a member of one of their boards. He quit because no one would listen to him. And trust me, he's way ahead of academics beyond me. This has been a world that does not want to listen to change. But I also believe it's a world that we can make change at this point. Okay, one is, I, at this point, am not a fan of augmented communication devices, because what the data is starting to show out there, especially if you do it with a young child, you're taking away part of that drive to learn how to talk, okay? Number 2, an older child, a kid in that position, and the apraxia, it's all coming from the same areas of brain we're talking about, okay? So the first step is, if I can get the brain working, then I need the help of a good oral motor speech pathologist to help your son or child redevelop those skills. But yes, they are absolutely recoverable. Okay. I really have almost like 2 sets of kids out there. 3, I would have to probably say. Kids who are not as good as I'd like them to do, and I'm still doing everything I can to pull them better. I have a bunch of well kids out there. Some of those children are off of all medication and doing fine. Probably the majority of my well kids, I'm either having to maintain with an antiviral, because I know I've not gotten rid of that viral process even though I'm suppressing it, okay, or the usage of an SSRI. Some of this gets into, again, how much was that brain injured, how slow was it, and how much do I need to help it? But the key is, and I believe this fully, I've got kids out there with me who have been on medication 8, 9 years at this point, and they are healthy. Well, what you look for in pediatrics is how a kid grows and develops. And the nice thing that started coming back to me was pediatricians would see these kids for checkups. Again, in a nice way, shake their head to the mom and say, I have no idea what Dr. Goldberg's doing, but whatever he's doing, keep doing it, it's working. Okay, now in the antifungals, I will generally use Nizoral, diflucan, Lamisol, and for maintenance, go to something called oral amphotericin B. Now, let me stress something. I used nystatin in the very beginning. Very ineffective right now. Most yeast, just like bacteria, are resistant to things. Natural antifungals are going to do very little. The Nizoral, diflucan, Lamisol, in theory, again, you need to monitor liver functions on a child on those, but as long as you monitor it, there's no hidden harm, no hidden danger, okay? Now, when I bring up the term amphotericin B, this is what makes many doctors really shift their eyes. Because what we learned again in medical school was before diflucan, amphotericin, which we often called amphoterable, was used only IV for severe fungal infections and has multiple toxicities and multiple side effects, okay? Now, I knew this ahead of time, but one of my learning experiences was somewhere around the mid-'80s. A mother brings me this box from France called Fungalin, over the counter in France, okay? And it was over the counter at the time in England, and it was amphotericin B. Now, why? As it turns out, IV, it's very toxic. Orally, it's a very strong antifungal, but it doesn't get absorbed into the body. It is a very safe maintenance, so I don't go to it until I have a kid in good shape, and I'm looking again, if their immune system is not totally healthy yet, I'm looking for a maintenance medication, but that's how I use that. The answer would be yes, but I want you to think about it a little differently. Again, what I said earlier, when I first meet a child, I'm looking to say, can I explain what's gone wrong? So I'm looking at pregnancy, I'm looking at delivery, I'm looking at afterwards. Now, you went through a horrendous time there, but optimistically, your child was born premature, and they sent him home with you telling him you're going to be fine. Okay? Now, here's the catch-22. When, again, I go back in this case to NIH, 1992. While they were busy making fun of all these adults with yuppie flu, they started saying, wait, there's something real here. And that was a learning experience. Think of this neuroimmune axis, okay? What we're taught in pediatrics on asthma, okay, that's a common problem, right? I don't have a blackboard here, but think about it. You cross a line and you wheeze, okay? But that can be there because of a disposition, because of illness, because of exposure, and something pushes you over that line and you now wheeze, okay? What we're learning on this neuroimmune axis, you can have multiple combination of stresses. In adults, they admit it. Okay, you can be depressed, that's a stress. You can have surgery, that's a stress. You can be ill, that's a stress. You can name a lot of other things that cause stress. It's almost the same principle. You build up a level, and somewhere you throw that neuroimmune axis off. Now, what I've seen, and this is exactly what applies to your child, by the way, is in fairness, again, in pediatrics, we would say, hopefully, he looks fine. Okay, and by the way, hopefully the oxygen they gave was monitored right and no harm was done that way, okay? But if you think of that, as you said, significant stress on your child, in the world we're living in, yeah, he's a total setup for whether he's going to go into any of this neuroimmune stuff. Now, that's part of the difference, by the way. You have to put in two equations. This happened to children in the 60s or 70s. We didn't have an epidemic of chronic fatigue in adults. We didn't have an epidemic of autism. There has been a change, but that change, again, is not mercury, it's not what we're doing locally. Somewhere the environment has changed. So what you're looking at is a bunch of predisposed individuals, and then you put the right stresses in there, and that's what goes over the edge there. There's a slide I didn't include today that my wife had put up a number of years ago. I included in a presentation, and it basically was someone sitting behind a desk, a kid misbehaving. Sign up there was actually veterinarian, and the doctor's telling the mother to hit the kid over the head with a newspaper, okay? Now, point of that, you got the wrong specialist looking at your children. This is not a psychological disorder. This is not a psychiatric disorder, and this is the problem. Your son's having real issues there. Again, as I tried to present in the discussion, it's an alphabet soup. Depending upon where you fall, you get a label. But unless we start doing scans, unless we start looking at your son and saying, this is what is wrong, and this is how we treat him, unfortunately, you're spending money, you're doing what you can to help your son, and unfortunately, a lot of it will be wrong. This is what's got to change. I'm on your side completely.
Okay. Well, am I going at it right? Should I be going?
I would see the neurologist, but I would, again, try to approach him from, wait, my son's got medical issues. You mentioned the motor issues. You mentioned the lack of processing. That's not a hyperactive ADD kid. I'll sit here ahead of time and give you a guarantee that your son has decreased blood flow in the temporal lobe, so you don't want stimulant meds. And with the motor issues, you don't quite know, is this tied into the prematurity or is there a virus? But that's where you try to start working up.
Okay, let me just mention again, there's stories just like mine, Adderall, Strattera, Concerta, Ritalin.
Those have no place in your son.
Risperdal, Clonidine, Prozac.
Prozac, maybe. It depends on whether it agrees with him. That's the only thing you said that might be good, might be constructive.
What about the Zoloft?
Zoloft would be okay too. There again, you're choosing between what agrees with him. Okay, now here's what you have to look at, and this again is one of the mistakes being made out there. If you understand the way I said things, again, yeast is not the reason your children have autism, and again, if I said that, I'd be in big trouble. But if you understand they have a stressed immune system, they are not able to control that part of things, they are going to be very prone to that overgrowth. One of the lessons you learn in medicine, I can give your child the best antifungal in the world, and if his body isn't helping me, I'm going to have a really hard time keeping that in control. Okay, we learned this back in medicine. At a time when an organism we call pneumococcus was so sensitive to penicillin, the joke was if you breathed it, you killed the organism. Children who were black and got pneumococcus, they were subject to severe bone disease and other infections because their body's immune system didn't handle that even with penicillin going. So the key to understanding the children is, yeah, they're going to be prone to yeast overgrowth. The mistake people are making out there, and they're going to induce more resistance rather than help your children, is I'll give you 2 weeks or a month of diflucan. I cleared up what was there. Now we're going to stop it. Okay? Now tell me something. Unless you put your son in a glass bubble and no sugar of any kind, he's going to get yeast back again in the next month or two. In essence, what they're doing with your children is they start and stop things instead of continuing a plan. I rotate around, I change what I'm doing, but the starting and stopping only induces more resistance there. Right, let me use that because diflucan, again, makes a good example. There's two kind of things you're going to see with diflucan. One is, and this happens, by the way, with the generic now particularly, a kid may go on it and go hyper. Okay? Now, if that happens and doesn't resolve after 4 or 5 days, I change the medicine because what that basically is saying is I've given that kid something that is firing off their system to which they are chemically sensitive. But it isn't necessarily diflucan. I'll have people get a compounded, plain diflucan, and the kid does fine on it. But what you do get is what's called a kill-off. I didn't discuss this with you guys totally in the presentation, but using an antiviral, using an antifungal, you expect what they call is a kill-off. Now let's use the antifungal. Let's assume there is an overgrowth. You start treating. What are you doing? You're killing those organisms, okay? The kid's going to be achy, tired. An older kid will tell you they're headachy. Now, there's two possible mechanisms for that. One is what we call a Herxheimer reaction. We know that in medicine, we treat certain bacteria, you kill them, the body reacts allergenically, and you get this weird reaction in the body, okay? Flip side, what do yeast do? They make formaldehydes, aldehydes, toxins to our body, right? So argumentatively, you kill them off, you may be releasing a bunch of that at one time. But the key is, if I get that kill off, then I know there's something there, and then the next step is that kid better start to look better and feel better between 10 days to 2 weeks, or I'm changing antifungal. I may hit a problem, but it doesn't mean that antifungal is working right. And this is what I said to all of you earlier. You have to go step by step, because just because diflucan is a good antifungal, it may not be picking up what your son needs.
Right, and then do you continue that?
Now, if he gets through that kill-off, he's brighter, sharper, feeling better, then I will use diflucan for up to a year. Again, I monitor liver functions, I monitor any child I have on medication, but it's actually turning out, even though it's strong, it's turning out to be a very safe antifungal as long as you monitor it. In essence, I rotate around. My philosophy with children is, again, even though I'm doing things differently, I tend to be very conservative, believe it or not. Even though some of these medicines are now used very long-term, just philosophically, if I'm using diflucan, I'm using Lamisol, I will rotate those at least by a year point, okay? Now, the exception to that is Nizoral. When I first came into this and talked about using Nizoral, I was told you don't want to use it for more than a year. I limit Nizoral to 6 to 8 months. Again, I tend to be conservative. The reason for that is it's an excellent antifungal. Even though there is more liver issues with adults, there's really almost no issues with children with Nizoral. And more important, it has a very mild effect on the adrenocortical axis that may be helping the immune system. So for that reason, I actually like it. But again, because of that adrenocortical effect, that's why I have to limit how long I leave someone on it. Basically, the combination of immune system telling me some things. In other words, if I've got a child and they have low NK cells and I'm still fighting a virus, even though I haven't gone to the level of testing that will let me define each piece of this, again, we're ready to do it, I know I need to maintain that child. So I'm generally going to keep an antifungal going until I get to the point that child's healthy, doing well, and then depending upon their immune markers and where they are viral, I will see if I want to wean that child off of an antifungal, or if I want to switch, and this is what I often do, is switch to amphotericin B. It gives me a little safety valve, but it's not going into the child's body.
Did you say that yeast regrows?
This is the key. If you don't have a totally well child, it's going to regrow. There's no way it's not going to regrow. Question was what antivirals I use, and I do use acyclovir, which is Zovirax. I use Valtrex, and I will use Fanvir. For the record, I will not give your children something called ganciclovir or something called foscovir. There have been a few people, I hate to say this, in the DAN network who have done that. Ganciclovir and foscovir have a little side effect. They can kill you. So again, my philosophy is I will do everything I can medically to help your children, but I better not do something that can hurt them.
Excellent question, and re-asked me if I leave any part out.
One, your daughter is a very typical story out there, okay? And I think that the critical, again, go back to my discussion. Her sleep cycle is off. I don't have to run a test on her. I don't have to evaluate her. She does not go into a normal sleep cycle, okay? The difference, though, your daughter's 3 years old. Before I go to an SSRI, I'm going to do diet. I'm going to do antifungal. I may do antiviral, depending upon the blood work. And there's a 90% probability that you'll have a very good kid at that point. Okay, if you can catch a kid young enough, you know, again, things change. Now, the truth is, unlike when I started with this, I am also much more open if I need an SSRI with a 3, 4, 5-year-old child. Again, it depends on how severely the process hit the brain, how much areas are shut down. But as I said, I have a lot of children, you do the first couple of steps, and they're there. Now, with your daughter, because this, again, the sleep cycle is a major point. One is I would absolutely follow what I'm saying to you about diet. Just try that alone right now. Stop dairy, whole wheat, whole grains. In her case, where you get this level of lack of attention, strawberry, you know, the hyperside. Limit sugars, strawberry cherries. You do what you can to start to help her body cool down a little bit, okay? Now, you said something else, and this is a very, very important direction for all of you. She's starting to talk, okay? Now, this is where I hope with this meeting today, I'm going to get a lot of you changing your views. What they've done out there, what I see with kids, 6, 7, 8 years old, and this, unfortunately, I really feel is a major negative of ABA or any of that direction. It's like the kid winds up with a lot of information or a lot of words and doesn't know what to do with it. No one bothered to connect the dots. I don't know, dots. Now, what I was taught early along, I didn't start off as a speech pathologist, okay? But what I was taught, and it gets down to normal physiology, if your daughter is being asked to say words, let's say, and they're what's called a stage 3, stage 4 skill, and I defer to a speech pathologist when I say that, no, you got to go back with the people you're working with. And even though she's starting to say words, you start from the bottom. You make sure she's got all of her early oral motor skills. You make sure she masters stage 1, stage 2, and then you move forward. This is the mistake people are making out there. No child, even if they're doing well, is going to succeed if we don't give them a foundation that makes sense. This is, in fact, with the older kids, this becomes my biggest problem, is I'll get their brains working, and I almost have to have the parents start over educationally because what's there is just disconnected. So you're at a young child, start carefully, build her language, but build it right. Now, as you say that, let me give you a piece of it. I've jumped around and sidetracked, and I apologize to all of you, but there is a way for you to approach the speech pathologist. Another parent asked me about approaching the pediatrician. I gave you some articles then, and I mentioned IEP. This is what I'm telling most mothers in my practice, and if you think about it, it's the way to go into the doctor, the IEP, the speech pathologist. While they have heard everything about autism in the last 20, 30, 40 years, realistically, and acknowledge it because this is the truth. You walk in there, hey, I know you've heard everything. I know I may just come across like another mom in denial, okay? But look what's happened in just the last 9 months. And this is what I tell parents to go in there armed with, hopefully armed and dangerous. 1, the Johns Hopkins article. That is hard science, and it says that there may be another type of process going on in your child, okay? 2, even the announcement by the Mayan Institute, CAN and NAR in April. Oh, look, we found an immune connection to autism. And finally, that announcement out of the autism conference in July. We're going to have to rethink our opinion of autism. And what you try to do is go into your doctor, your therapist, anyone, and say, look, data is supporting. It's much more likely my child started as a regular child than with something called autism. Please, I need your help. I need your help as a specialist. If all the speech pathologists out there, all they did was go back to their basic training and start to look at your children for what they can do, you'll get a better effect. So this is the way you want to approach them when you go into an IEP, you go to a doctor, use data, use logic, and most of the time they'll start to listen to you. What I have again said to many, many parents, if you guys will follow your instincts, you know more than probably 98 to 99% of the experts out there. I can't tell you how many, again, I'm a pediatrician. First lecture in medical school on pediatrics was listen to the mothers. You guys are not listened to because the world thinks you're all wrong. Follow your instincts. You guys know more about your kids than most of those experts. Well, this is going to be the difficult side of things, okay? Again, right now I think the viral side is a horrendous problem. You might, at this point, again, present some of my papers, present the work. What I would tell you, you should at least try to do is see if your doctor will run an immune panel that includes those NK cells, run that alpha interferon, okay, and run an HHV6 titer. If any of those are significantly elevated, now one is, if alpha interferon's elevated, there should be no question, if minimum, they send you to an infectious disease doctor because that says there is a virus going on. In fact, Michelle, I'm sure, can tell you that's how she presented, with an extremely active virus in the background. 2, if you can get, if the HHV6 titer is elevated, some doctors would tell you, and this is what happened, by the way, in the world of Epstein-Barr, oh, an elevated titer doesn't mean anything. Now, let's get real. Let's go back to medical school. What I was taught in medical school was that if you are immunized, if you are infected by a virus, what happens? If it's a virus, you first mount what's called an IgM response, and that goes away pretty quickly. And then you mount an IgG response, okay? And it goes up, and then it comes down but it never goes back to normal, to zero, okay? Your body remembers that you were exposed to that vaccine, you were exposed to that virus, and you're going to respond faster next time, okay? That was physiology. That's the way it was supposed to work. Now, what's happened to adults with chronic fatigue syndrome, what's happening to your children? On the adults, the biggest thing going on was they were walking around with sky-high Epstein-Barr titers that stayed up here. We're talking about levels that we were taught were acute infections, but they kept running. Well, this was one of the first mistakes that ultimately is coming back to you and your children. Instead of the NIH, the CDC, saying, wait a minute, this is not Epstein-Barr, but it's not normal to walk around with high titers like that. Maybe we better figure out what's wrong. They made the shift. Well, it's not Epstein-Barr, so it must be psychosomatic. Big mistake, okay? Now, here's where I'm leading to. You run that HHV6 titer, okay? There are lab normals. For the record, normals are 1 to 10, 1 to 20, up to 1 to 80, okay? If your child is borderline, 1 to 80, 1 to 160. Now, myself, I would treat a 1 to 160, okay? But a doctor might look at it and say, well, this doesn't prove anything. Get him to repeat the titer a month or two later, okay? If it's above 1 to 160, 1 to 320, 1 to 640, any of those numbers, those either represent acute infection, your kid just had HHV6, or they are a chronic infection back there, and you might, again, this is going to be the hard part at first, get the doctor to go along with whether he would give you a trial of Zovirax or Valtrex. Again, part of this, I'm hoping I'll get in a position where I will be getting some help and I can spend my time consulting with people. I'm hoping we'll spread this because I really know what a problem it is. I keep hoping we'll get some hearings in Congress where maybe they hear the truth and not just what the groups want them to hear. And if that happens, I believe you'll have an entirely different medical system helping you. I can't tell you for sure what she's hearing at that point, okay? But I can tell you that I guarantee you her auditory processing is off. And whatever that is, it's disturbing her. She can't sort it out like you and I might, okay? I don't think these kids have acute, super acute hearing. They certainly don't have hearing loss, most of them. But, again, how the brain is receiving those signals may be very mixed up in her. One step at a time. The simple step is start the diet. Then you try to work with your doctor to see, can you come away from Adderall? For instance, frontal lobe. If there really is frontal lobe hyperness, Strattera, Wellbutrin, work on those areas, much safer than the stimulant meds, okay? Again, in your son's case, and I meant to bring it up with this mother over here, these children are prone to panic attacks, anxiety attacks. He may have very well felt his brain not working right, but guess what? That only confirms what I said to you a little while ago. His temporal lobes are off. The Adderall isn't helping that at all. One of the lessons, again, you learn out of this, when this happens to an adult brain, they have panic attacks, they have anxiety attacks, your children have that. So in a sense, it really does come down to trying to balance the whole thing out, and given where you are, you got to start the changes, but you don't do everything radical at one time, even though in the long run it'll be better to make a change. No, again, wrong idea on children. You get a healthy child, they eat. You're doing the wrong thing to them, they won't eat, okay? Think of it, what I would tell you to do from your child's direction is talk to your doctor who's managing this. Again, the diet you can start, today, and then wait a few weeks, have a meeting, and see if at minimum he'll let you try to start to bring in an SSRI. Again, you have to sort out between Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, what's right. And my bet is if you get that on board and it's agreeing with him, you're going to find yourself at minimum able to wean down the Adderall and ultimately perhaps be off of it. Well, you need to hope, again, more people are getting open-minded, but again, we need to speed up that situation for all of you. My pleasure. Bluntly, what I'm hoping for, I've said this to the people that help organize this, and again, I said it earlier in talking, the best thing for every one of you will be to get together and let's start a revolution. If we can, I know there are plenty of parents. I've actually talked to some people, it's almost like my wife says, that's the enemy camp. I've talked to mothers involved in the mercury issues, okay, who wouldn't talk to me 1 minute 5 years ago, okay? What I do know is many, many parents out there are not happy. They are as frustrated as you guys are. They are seeing dead ends for their children. We need some of you to start a movement. I've called enough is enough, or you can call it anything you want. But let's create a focus, and my belief is, with the people that are about to help me, if we get the focus like that, we can change this and get access to your kids much faster than you could imagine. Well, again, this has reached, for me, this has reached a level that I've been doing this enough year, I can give that, I mean, again, we're looking at setting up protocols, we're looking at doing it in an organized way, and my biggest difficulty is, basically, I make my living in a private practice, so it has been very hard for me up to this time to sit and say, well, I'm going to be consulting with doctors all day around the country, but people are about to step up to help me be able to shift that way more. And believe me, I mean, my wife listens to me screaming and yelling all the time, because while she tells me, and it's true, that I should be very, very thankful for what I can do to help the kids I work with, I know how many of you are out there and how many kids are out there, and I personally will not be happy until we see this change for all of you. So I'm trying, I promise you.